For our North Country history lesson, we're honoring a man who forever changed Watertown for Black residents.
Emily Griffin tells us about Henry Barr, a freed slave who influenced several landmarks in the area.
In the 1800s, Court Street in Watertown looked much different than what we see today. Namely, this area, which was called Barr Block. This block used to bustle with business, the large building housing shops and apartments owned by Henry Barr. He was a freed slave who came from Kentucky and moved to Watertown in 1865. He was a talented barber who was said to have the finest barber shop in the city. He operated several, the most prominent of which was in the Woodruff Hotel during its prime. Barr was known to many as the professor because he taught other residents the ways of barbering and business, funding several other Black-owned shops. As one of the most prominent men in the African American community, Barr established the Zion Church community in 1878 and built this church in 1909. He was one of 3 founding trustees, and today there is a section of the church named in his honor, displaying information about the Underground Railroad, of which he was connected. Barr lived to be 72 years old, and to his last breath, he was protecting his beloved Barr Block. He was trying to stop a drunken scoundrel from harassing a resident when the man struck Barr down, causing injuries which ended up killing Barr. Without Barr leading the block, it eventually fell into disrepair. It was torn down in 1987. However, Barr's legacy remains. From a freed slave to one of Watertown's most successful businessmen, Barr set the bar, proving that a man's race and background shouldn't deter him from leading a remarkable life. Emily Griffin, 7 News.